Hello and welcome back to Russ's Movie Corner. My name is Russ, and as you can see, I am sitting in front of my movie corner. I have a Star Wars t-shirt on today, even though I'm not talking about Star Wars. I have my Doctor No movie right next to me, and judging by the lack of a frame around me, that means that we are now talking about the James Bond Retrospective. I had an introductory video for this, and it's been a couple of weeks since I actually uploaded that video because I've been busy with other things. I've had a lot going on in my life. There's been some things going on with the channel. I've had some other personal things going on. But I'm going to try to get this done as quickly as possible because it shouldn't take that long to actually talk about all the different films. And as you can see right over my shoulder, I have World Is Not Enough, a VHS tape. I actually have a few VHS tapes on my movie wall behind me because I absolutely adore some of those old VHS tapes and different things like that. In fact, just above me, it's actually out of frame. Right up above here is Hunt for Red October. I have Dune from 1984 right behind me here. I just have them there because they're really fun. I mean, I actually have like the entirety of the Dune series right here behind me. So I have this is the Steelbook. I'll just show you here. This is the Steelbook extended edition of the 1984 Dune. It actually has the theatrical and the extended versions. This is the collector's edition of the 2000 miniseries of Frank Herbert's Dune. I also have the follow-up Children of Dune miniseries, which actually starred James McAvoy. This is one of his first roles in Hollywood, one of his first major roles in Hollywood. And then I have Dune and Dune Part 2. Okay? So I'm a huge Dune fan. I love Dune. It's one of my favorite books of all time. James Bond is actually my favorite movie series of all time. A lot of people might think I love Star Wars because I have a lot of Star Wars t-shirts. I actually have all 9 films, plus Solo and Rogue One. I have a ton of RPG material. I have a ton of Star Wars miniatures from WotC. But that's not my favorite movie series of all time. Some people might say it's Star Trek. I have a ton of Star Trek stuff. In fact, I have basically on this shelf right down below Lord of the Rings here, I have all 3 Star Trek films. I have the first 3 seasons of Next Generation. On DVD, I have a whole bunch of the fan collectives, like Here's the Q. I have the Borg. I have the Captain's Log, the alternate things. I have all of the movies, all the way up to Nemesis. I have even the Kelvin movies. I don't have any of the newer shows, like Strange New Worlds. I've only seen like a couple of episodes of those. I haven't seen any of Picard, so I have no idea what goes on. I'm more of a Trekker, not a Trekkie. But even that's not my favorite series. It's actually, okay, this film series right here, okay, James Bond. I absolutely love the James Bond series. It is one of my favorite series of all time, and one of the things that I absolutely love about the James Bond series is how they've, especially with this old original series, how they tried to connect a lot of the plots together over the years. So how they tried to keep things consistent throughout the characters. Even though they're changing actors, they tried to keep the character consistent. So similar to movies like, say, The Incredible Hulk, where Edward Norton played the Incredible Hulk in 2008, 2009 timeframe, but they decided that when the kind of things broke down and Edward Norton decided that he wasn't going to play the character, they asked him who he would like to play, who he would like to have play his character going forward, and he said Mark Ruffalo, and so they brought in Mark Ruffalo, but they didn't change the character. Okay, and that was kind of what they were doing with this. They were trying to say, here's this James Bond guy. And there's been a number of wild theories out there as to who James Bond is and what's going on and blah, blah, blah. I didn't get into a whole lot of those in the introduction. I didn't want to go off the deep end with it, okay? But today I'm going to kind of talk about the fact that there were a few Um, there were a few movies that were tried before before this movie came out. There was a few things that had happened. Um, there was a couple of times that Bond had tried to be brought to the um, the 007 moniker had been tried to be brought to the screen, and like they um, they didn't succeed. One of the main, so like Casino Royale was actually adapted 3 times. There was a made for TV movie that not many people saw. There was a television show called Climax that brought that basically was a humorous twist on the whole story. Um and let me see here if I have it. Let me see here. Because there was, hang on, there was. Trying to remember what it was, but yeah. Yeah, in October of 1954, James Bond made his debut on the Chrysler Climax Mystery Theater series. A live TV version of Casino Royale saw CBS making use of poetic license, with Bond, Barry Nelson, as a fast-talking American secret agent, a far cry from the suave, cool British spy, aided by British agent Clarence Leiter, Michael Pate. Peter Lorre as villain Le Chiffre stole the show even when he came back to life, getting up moments after being killed by Bond in order to head back to the comfort of his dressing room. And I was pretty sure that there was one. I was pretty sure there was another one, but anyway, so that was the first kind of attempt, and it was kind of interesting because they had like all these different characters named Bond. Like they had Jimmy Bond, they had James Bond, they had this Bond, they had that Bond. They had all these different characters named Bond, and they did a whole bunch of different things with it. It absolutely had nothing to do with what Casino Royale is. Okay, and it wasn't until 2006 that we got the reboot. In my opinion, the reboot to end all reboots, this version of Casino Royale. Okay? This is the original Casino Royale reboot from Eon Productions, starring Daniel Craig. And his casting actually caused quite a stir back in the day. Now, I was not familiar, or at least not that familiar, with Daniel Craig's portrayal of anything really, except for he played the American Alex West in Lara Croft Tomb Raider, the one starring Angelina Jolie. Okay, most people kind of forget that that he was in this film, and I don't know that I have a picture of him in the. I don't have a picture of him in the little insert here. So basically, yeah, he was in this movie. Okay. And when I saw him, he was very thin. He was speaking with an American accent, because, of course, he's British. And I was kind of like, what is going on here? This is kind of weird. And he, and I had not had the opportunity to see Casino Royale in the theater. And when we get to that, I'll kind of talk a little bit more about my experience of watching it. And I had a lot of people tell me that it was really good because I was kind of holding out on it. I wasn't quite sure if I was going to like it or not. Because again, my only experience with Daniel Craig being Lara Croft Tomb Raider, I wasn't sure how to take that until I actually sat down and watched it. But we'll get to that in about 5 videos. Okay, so now let's talk about Dr. No. Now, a lot of people probably wonder, well, where did this guy come from? Sean Connery. Where did Sean Connery come from? Well, Sean Connery was an underwear model, okay? And he was living in Scotland. He was an underwear model. And there was this international search for James Bond. They had contacted everybody. Cary Grant, David Niven. They contacted, like, a whole bunch of people. And the producers thought, well, if we can't get a big name at the time, like a Cary Grant or a David Niven, then let's get a relatively unknown person in here to play the role. Okay? In fact, it was actually Ian Fleming's kind of choice was either David Niven or maybe Hoagie Carmichael. Because if you read the original Casino Royale, Vesper Lind actually comments that there's something Hoagie Carmichael-ish about James Bond. But they ended up going with this unknown Scottish underwear model. And it worked brilliantly because people absolutely loved him. Okay? Even though Ian Fleming notoriously hated the man until Goldfinger, and we'll get to that in a minute. He didn't think that he was going to be a very good James Bond. In fact, when he saw the film, he thought, that's not James Bond. What are you doing? And it wasn't until Goldfinger, like I said, we'll get to that in a minute, that he finally gave his approval, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So, let's talk about Dr. No for a minute. If you go back, if you've never seen a James Bond film, or if you've only seen, like, say, the Daniel Craigs, or maybe the Pierce Brosnans, and you're kind of like, wow, I didn't realize that this franchise has been going on this long. I kind of want to see some of the original ones. Be warned. This movie's rough. It is not the typical James Bond adventure that you're used to. In fact, it's more in line with the book, actually. With some changes made. I covered this in the introduction, to where they changed the villain of the book. Okay, the original villain of the book, Dr. No, let me grab onto this here really quick. Says, still recovering from the denouement of his last assignment, that was From Russia with Love, this is the book plot, Bond is given a soft option by M to investigate the disappearance of the head of our man in Jamaica. The obvious suspect is a local bird dung merchant with his own island, Dr. No. And then it says, this plot is in essence a reprise of that of Live and Let Die, the book. 007 investigates some malfeasance and finds a solution on an evil magnate's private island in the Caribbean. But that and the general air of implausibility are virtually the only flaws in Bond's 6th outing. And then Raymond Chandler came in to praising Fleming's un-British, in Chandler's eyes, willingness to escape from conventional English, his sense of place and acute sense of pace, and concluding with that it was masterful, beautifully written. And I will say this, okay? Any book where you drop a load of bird dung on your villain is awesome in my mind. Literally, I remember reading the book, and I got to the end. I was getting close to the end, and I got to the end, And Bond basically like takes this one guy that works for Dr. No and throws him out of this crane and like throws him off of a cliff off the island. Jumps in, starts working the things around, gets it lined up because he sees Dr. No standing over there, and he's like, take this, kunk, and then just like drops like about 1,000 pounds of guano on the villain, just crushing him. I was like, that's awesome. Now, that's not what happens in the movie. So, what happens in the movie is Bond, it actually starts out in a casino, and this is where we get the Bond, James Bond line. It's actually from this movie, okay? It starts with this woman, Sylvia Trench. Bond says, it's like they're playing cards, and she loses, and then she goes, Banco. They're playing Baccarat, and she says, Banco. And he goes, I admire your courage, miss. And then she says, Trench, Sylvia Trench. And I admire your luck, mister. And then you see him standing there with a cigarette lighter, and he's lighting up a cigarette, and he goes, Bond, James Bond. And it's like, wow. I mean, it's because he has that classic Sean Connery deep voice. And it really, really, really sells the character to where you kind of feel like he is James Bond at that point. And from there, James Bond gets a little message from headquarters. So he goes back to headquarters and with telling the woman that he's going to head off, that he has to dash off. Heads and he says, look, here's my address. Come by in a few days and we'll talk. And then he takes off and goes back to the office. The beginning of the film actually starts with the credits. There is no teaser in Dr. No. So if you're expecting that classic formula of there's a pre-credits teaser sequence, and then there's the credits song, and then there's the rest of the film, this movie doesn't have that. This movie goes directly from the song, which is actually just the James Bond theme. There is no Dr. No song. The theme song is just the James Bond song. You go directly from that into the film, and you see these guys walking along pretending to be blind, and they shoot this guy dead, and then they break into his office and they shoot her dead right as she turns on this like radio system. You find out that this guy's name was Strangways, okay? And he is sort of the head of Station J, I think it is, Jamaica, okay? That's kind of what MI6 would, at least in this movie series, would call their different stations around the world. Like Station C is Canada, Station H is Hong Kong, Station J is Jamaica. They have different stations all over the world gathering intelligence and then feeding that back to MI6 headquarters in London. And then that is disseminated to M, who then formulates the missions and then takes the double O's, hands them their missions, and then they go out and carry out said missions. Pretty self-explanatory. So, in this one, Bond is tasked with finding out what happened to Strangways. Also, what you find out is that you find that there's like a little thing, and there's a little filing cabinet, and this guy pulls it out, and he pulls out a file on Crab Key, and he pulls out a file on Dr. No. Then you find out, so Bond goes to Jamaica. He starts to explore. There's some different people doing some different things. There's some people tailing him. There's some shenanigans going on. And Bond finds out later that Felix Leiter, his brother from Langley, comes in and is like, doing this whole thing. And they find out that they were investigating the case from both ends. Okay? And that the Americans have been launching missiles attempting to go to the moon, and this signal has been toppling them, which is basically it sends a radio beam that screws up the guidance system and causes it to fall into the ocean and crash, thereby wasting millions of dollars and bankrupting the American space program. Okay? And so, unlike the book, which was this bird dung magnate who just wanted privacy, and anybody who came to his island, he would just quietly disappear. Okay, and some locals that had gone missing on the island were being investigated by Strangways, and that's why he was killed. And basically, like Doctor No, they kept this part either similar or the same, and it's been a while since I've actually read the book myself, so I could be getting this wrong. But I know in the movie he stole a bunch of money, which set up from the Chinese Tong Syndicate, which set him up in Jamaica to topple the missiles. And I believe in the in the book, it was very similar. He stole some money from the Tongs, and that's one of the reasons why he was killing people that came to his island, because he didn't want a chance the Tongs stumbling across him and finding him. Okay, and so he had set up this elaborate maze filled with traps and different things to elaborately kill people. Okay, and that will come up here in the movie in a minute. And so basically, what ends up happening is that Bond ends up going over to the island. Okay, and ends up finding out that there's this gal named Honey Rider, played by Ursula Andress, and they Bond and a friend of his quarrel, and then Honey try to go and find new things. Try to find out about this Doctor No guy. Okay, and they end up like being chased all over the island until Quarrel is finally killed, and Bond and Honey are captured. Okay, because there was supposedly a dragon, which was actually like a tank with a flamethrower on it. Okay, painted to look like a dragon. And so they then get taken to Doctor No's island. Doctor No then kind of helps decontaminate them because they've been in a swamp, which is mildly radioactive from the fact that he's running an actual nuclear reactor on his island. And then so Bond ends up like meeting with Doctor No, who was played by Joseph Weissman, and he says, and they have this kind of a back and forth, and that's when you find out that in the movie, because at the time the book Thunderball had come out by that time, and so they decided to kind of tie into that book by creating Thunderball, or by creating Spectre as the villains, the big bads. Okay, so in this movie, Doctor No works for Spectre. Okay, the special executive for counterintelligence, terrorism, revenge, and extortion. And so you find out like what's going on and why things are happening that way. And so James Bond then goes and he gets placed into the cell. He escapes from the cell and kind of goes through this kind of a maze of pipes and things, and then he comes out at the reactor complex, where he ends up having kind of a final showdown with Doctor No on a reactor catwalk, where he basically like knocks Doctor No onto a little platform that lowers him down into the reactor itself, and basically he burns up. At least that's what we're led to assume, because the last thing we see of him is and Doctor No, he doesn't have like real hands. He's got like metal claws as hands because the Tongs cut his hands off for stealing. Okay, you find out that he's half Chinese, half German, and he was accepted by the Tongs, and the Tongs, killed him, or thought they killed him, but they also took his hands, and so he has these metal hands, and then Bond uses that to exploit him to get him to fall into the reactor and die. And then essentially Bond finds Honey, they escape, and then thus begins the various, like, the trope, I guess you could say, of Bond ending up somewhere with the lady at the very end, okay? Where they're kissing or they're, doing whatever they're doing, usually with people searching for them or finding them or doing something like that, okay? And so that's kind of what happens. And so, yeah, so if you're looking for one of the better James Bond films, this one's pretty rough. It really is. It is not the best Bond film out there. Okay? It's pretty mid, but it's a lot of fun. Okay? The centipede that was in the book was replaced with a tarantula in the movie. I think because tarantulas, being, large hairy spiders, kind of make people's skin crawl a little bit more than a centipede would. But it's no less, like, tense. Like, that whole entire scene is extremely tense. They still have the Professor Dent character. They still have a bunch of other things going on. So they have a lot of different things happening. And so it was a very decent outing, and it made enough at the box office that it allowed them to then carry on to the next film in the series, which is From Russia with Love. Okay? Now, this was actually Sean Connery's personal favorite Bond film. He actually loved the character of James Bond in this film because he thought it was a quintessential Cold War film. Even though, here again, they changed the villains from Smirch, or Smirt Spionum, the KGB, to Spectre. Okay? Where they were essentially playing the Russians and the British off of each other in an effort to find this machine called a lector decoder. I think in the book it was called a Spectre. It was actually spelled like Spektor. It's a Spector. Not Spectre as in the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion. Which is why they changed it to a lector decoder, because it sounded better and it wouldn't confuse people. Why is the organization going after something that's named after themselves? Doesn't make sense. So yeah, this is actually Sean Connery's personal favorite Bond film of all time. He loved From Russia with Love. He loved making it. He loved starring in it. He thought Daniela Bianchi was an amazing actress. He loved Lot Lenya. He thought that the guy that played Donald Grant, Red Grant, in the film, did an amazing job. Pedro Armendariz, this was one of his main Hollywood roles. He would actually go on to star in the series later, right before his death, which we'll get to in a couple videos. It was an amazing film. If you're looking for the quintessential Bond film, okay, that will jumpstart something, this is going to be the Bond film. Okay? And I'll be right back. Sorry about that. Thought I had a call coming in. Thought it was an important call, but it turns out it wasn't anything. Okay. You gotta love spams. Okay. And no, that's not a segue into a sponsor. I don't have any sponsors yet. I don't have enough views. So, back to what I was saying. From Russia with Love is the quintessential, in my opinion, the quintessential Bond film if you ever want to just start watching James Bond. Because there is a pre-credit sequence. It's pretty exciting. The title sequence actually doesn't have any music. They actually had a song written up, but they decided to make it an instrumental for the title sequence, and then that appears at the end credits, the actual vocal version of it. So on any compilation of Bond music, they will usually have the vocal version and not the actual version. This also introduced the 007 theme, which would then be used throughout most of the series in one way, shape, or form. Which was that dun 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 and kind of music, kind of a faster paced music. It was used heavily in a lot of the Sean Connerys and a lot of the Roger Moores. And it's, to me, it's actually one of my personal favorite Bond films. Is From Russia with Love. It's a great film. The first time I watched it, I almost fell asleep watching it. Because I had started, unfortunately, I had started with other Bond films. So going back to this one, it's not as action-oriented. It's more thriller. It's action thriller with the emphasis on thriller rather than just straight-up action. And so there was some parts that are kind of slow in the mid section of it, which are interesting now, but back when I was first watching, I wanted more of the action. And so when I started watching it, I was kind of like, Ugh. But once I sat down and actually watched the film a couple of times, I found that it was an amazing Bond film. So the plot is that Spectre is trying to kill James Bond for the death of Dr. No in the previous film. Okay? And they want to do it by playing the Russians against the British in Istanbul. So that's right. They go to Istanbul, Turkey, and they basically they take a Russian agent from the consulate, okay, and they convince her that she's going to defect to the British, and she's going and then she's going to take along this decoding machine called the Lector, and it is done by whom the audience knows, but the woman doesn't know, okay, that the person giving her the orders, Rosa Klebb, okay, has defected over to Spectre. And so she's a member of Spectre, but only the audience knows that. Bond doesn't know that. Tatiana Romanova doesn't know that. There's like nothing, none of that happens, okay? And so they kind of have some wacky misadventures throughout Istanbul. There's a fight in a gypsy camp. There's some things that go on. They get on the Orient Express and they head across the border. And before they get to the Yugoslavia border, which would take them from basically the Soviet Union at that time back into Western Europe, across the Iron Curtain, the wall that was there, separating the USSR from Western Europe, they had to jump off the train. Okay, and so they jump off the train, they get on a thing, and then they head to Venice, and they end up blowing up some people. Interestingly enough, this is actually Walter Gotell's first Bond role. He plays Morzeny, who is an operative of Spectre. Later on, he would play General Gogol in the starting in, I believe it was Spy Who Loved Me, all the way through like A View to a Kill. Actually, no, sorry. Living Daylights. Sorry, not A View to a Kill, Living Daylights. He played the character of General Gogol, okay? Who sometimes was an antagonist, other times was a person, because Glasnost was becoming a thing, or basically this detente of the spies kind of working together from West and East. How can we kind of bring these two worlds together? Because that was kind of the cooperation that was under, in the 80s, under the Reagan administration with Gorbachev. Okay? He had kind of opened up a line of communication, Ronald Reagan did, and to reflect that, they started to have more of the sort of like the Soviets were not antagonists, They were mostly like there were still some parts where there was antagonism going on, but mostly it was actually mostly the characters were kind of coming together and working together more. And we see that in Spy Who Loved Me, and we see that in some of the other films, which we'll get to in a little bit. But this was Walter Gattel's first role, and he ends up dying in very spectacular fashion. Bond basically like throws these fuel drums over, and then takes a flare pistol and shoots it into the water, and the barrels are leaking, and so all this gas gets blown up, and then it ends in a hotel room in Venice. And then Rosa Klebb tries to kill Bond with one of the first gadgets wielded by the villain, where she has like the little shoe that she taps her foot, and then like a little knife comes out, and then she tries to stab Bond with the thing. Now, in the book, Rosa Klebb actually does stab Bond with the shoe, and it has a poison on it, and Bond actually is like almost killed by it, which is in Dr. No, which is why he's given the easier assignment of going after this Dr. No to try to find out what happened to Strangways, to try to ease Bond back into work again, because he had almost died, basically. And also he was given the new gun, the Walther PPK, in the book, specifically because of the events of what happened. He was using a Beretta .25, and when he tried to shoot, the gun jammed, and he wasn't able to kill Rosa Klebb before she stabbed him. Okay, with her shoe, and he had to clear the jam, and then he shot her dead, and then the poison starts to take effect. So I forgot to mention that in the Dr. No portion of the video was we see him get his iconic pistol, the Walther PPK. Okay. And it was kind of funny because they mention that. M actually mentions that. It jammed up on your last job. You know, you're a 007, it means you're licensed to kill, not get killed. So that's how he got his iconic pistol. Funnily enough, the pistol that he's holding in the image is not the actual Walther PPK. Okay? It's really not. So, yeah, it was just one of those things. Now, many years later, EA, who held the license from basically Tomorrow Never Dies until, until this game actually came out back in, I think it was 2005, because it was right before Activision took over when they did Quantum of Solace. They produced this game, From Russia with Love, the video game. Interestingly enough, they actually go back in time to the 60s. They decided when they did Everything or Nothing, at that point they had done Tomorrow Never Dies, World Is Not Enough, 007 Racing on the original PlayStation. They had done Agent Under Fire on the Xbox and PlayStation 2, Nightfire on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox and PC and Game Boy Color. Game Boy Advance. Then they did Everything or Nothing, which was the first time that they were able to bring in the actual actors who were playing the characters on the screen. So, for instance, they had Pierce Brosnan, they had John Cleese, they had Judi Dench. They also brought in Willem Dafoe to voice one of the villains. They brought in Shannon Elizabeth. They brought in Maya, the singer. They brought in, all these different people to be these different characters essentially it's a gigantic James Bond film, okay, where you're actually playing as James Bond, fighting a villain, and so you actually felt like you were playing James Bond instead of just playing a character who was being voiced by someone who was not Pierce Brosnan, even though it looked like Pierce Brosnan. So, for instance, if we look at 007 Nightfire, you can clearly see that that's a promotional image from either Tomorrow Never Dies, or not Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, or Die Another Day. Okay? The picture of Pierce Brosnan there. And interestingly enough, the model on the back, it's kind of hard to see, but the model on the back is definitely Pierce Brosnan. Okay? Although the voice is a man known as Adam Blackwood, who had basically voiced James Bond since the Tomorrow Never Dies video game. Okay? He had voiced Bond for a number of years, doing that stuff. And so, essentially, once they got done with Everything or Nothing, with the smashing success of Everything or Nothing, which we will get to when we get to the Pierce Brosnans, to the Pierce Brosnan films, they decided to go back in time to the 60s and explore kind of that era of James Bond. And so they did From Russia with Love. And this came out on the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, and the PSP. Okay? Excellent game. The driving mechanics are very solid. They used the Need for Speed driving engine, actually, which made the driving very smooth. They used the same third-person engine that they use on Everything or Nothing, to make the combat system and the lock-on system, so that you could actually do things. They had a version of the Focus. They had a version of the Rappel, to where Bond would actually like take a little grappling hook and like throw it up to a ledge and then like climb up like this and then kind of climb up to the top, and then he would like pull out his gun again and then start firing. It was a solid game. If you have not checked this game out, I would recommend it. Interestingly enough, they got Maria Menounos and Natasha Bedingfield to play roles in this game, and they used the characters from the original From Russia with Love. Okay. So they used Robert Shaw as Red Grant. They used Lot Lenya. They used her as kind of a character model for the Rosa Klebb character. They used Pedro Armendariz' likeness from here as the head of Station T Turkey. They used Bernard Lee, even though they used a different voice actor because Bernard Lee's been dead for years. We'll get to that when we get to that. But they got Sean Connery to come back and voice the character. So his voice sounds a lot older than it did in this film. So if you're expecting this performance from this game, you're not going to get it. But it's still Sean Connery, which is amazing. I thought that was super awesome. And they actually have a cool little some things in here about like Bond girls. So they talked to Maria Menounos and Natasha Bedingfield about their roles. And they also talked to Sean Connery, and they actually kind of interview him, and they actually talk to him about coming back to Bond after him not being there for like 20 years at that point, because he played the character in Never Say Never Again, which we will get to. But since then, he hadn't played in Bond, and he had kind of retired from acting, so it took some coaxing from EA to get him to come back and play the character again. But once he saw what they were doing, and that they were doing it from his favorite Bond movie of all time, he was like, sign me up, dudes. Sign me up. And I actually was like super excited that they were able to do that with him. So it was pretty cool. All right, so that's From Russia with Love. Next up, Goldfinger. This is the movie that most people think of when they think of Bond. Is this one? This is the one that absolutely made James Bond an international sensation. Okay, from the slam bang opening to the shootout at Fort Knox to the high flying climax, this movie has it all. It has everything. Okay, I forgot to mention that in From Russia with Love featured the first appearance of Desmond Llewellyn. It was uncredited, but he played Major Boothroyd. Okay, who was the armorer. Okay, aka Q. His character's name is actually Major Boothroyd, but he was known as Q, or Quartermaster. Okay. Um, that was actually, and this is the movie where he was actually credited for his appearance as Q. Okay. So most people kind of miss the fact that the first Bond gadget was the briefcase that he gets in From Russia with Love that was given to him by Desmond Llewellyn's character. And then we see the actual Q arming scene in this film. Okay. So that's kind of the whole point of the thing, is why I say it's the quintessential Bond film, because it introduces the slam bang pre-credits, the singing title song, which was done by Shirley Bassey in a very 60s jazzy style. There's the introduction of the villain, who has some kind of nefarious plot. You have Q. You have, various different things that happen. There's a lot that goes on in this film that will set up the actual formula of Bond films until Casino Royale. Okay? Because when you think of a Bond film, when you watch a Pierce Brosnan, when you watch a Roger Moore, when you watch a Timothy Dalton, when you watch any of the movies after this one with Sean Connery or George Lazenby, they all follow this exact formula. And it goes something like this. You have your pre-credit sequence, your title sequence, then you have sort of generally speaking, something will happen, or Bond will get told about what's going on in the world. And then you will have him go to Q, or him get armed by Q at some point in the series, at some point in the movie. Bond goes out, meets up with the villain, things happen. Bond has to kind of piece it all together to figure out what the villain's nefarious scheme is. And then there's usually some big dynamic ending climax. And then Bond usually ends up escaping with the girl. Okay? And this is the movie that set all that up. Okay? 90% of people out there who love the Bond franchise, if you ask them what is your absolute all-time number one favorite James Bond film of all time is, they will point to this. Okay? They will point to Goldfinger, because they know that this movie is really, really good. Okay? And while it's not my personal favorite, it is probably in my top 10 or 15 Bond films, okay? Out of the 25 that have been made so far. It is definitely one of the better Bond films. It's when they started kind of perfecting the formula. And it really kind of lends itself to more action and a little bit less of the talking, a little bit less of the meandering, a little bit less of that. It kind of streamlined everything. Okay? And so this is the movie that most people will point to when you say James Bond. Most old school James Bond fans will point immediately to Goldfinger. Okay? And that's probably one of the reasons why Skyfall was the highest grossing Daniel Craig movie, because it went back to that formula. And it to the Bond fans that love Casino Royale and like Quantum of Solace, Skyfall was where they hit their stride. And it's because they went back to this formula. And it was amazing. Okay? We'll get to that when we get to that in the Daniel Craig films. So, what can be said about Goldfinger that hasn't already been said? Okay, you have a villain who is trying to irradiate Fort Knox to try to destroy the U.S. gold supply so that his gold can increase. You have the aptly named Kitty Galore. I'm not going to use the actual P word, okay? But in the film, and in the film they don't allude to this. They kind of like hint at it. But in the book, the reason why she is named P word galore is because she's a lesbian. And that's not a slam against LGBT or anything like that, okay? That was what Ian Fleming wanted, a female that wasn't just going to be head over heels in love with James Bond, okay? And Honor Blackman does a really good job in this film not, like, fawning over James Bond like we saw with Ursula Andress and Daniela Bianchi, okay? We kind of needed that after those. We didn't need the damsel in distress. We wanted a competent woman. And this is one of those things where a lot of people will point to this as kind of the first Bond girl who can actually kind of take care of herself in situations. She doesn't need to be rescued by James Bond in some way, shape, or form. Okay? She doesn't need to be carried. She doesn't need to have things happen to her. She's very independent. And that's something that you don't see in a lot of the early James Bond films. A lot of the early James Bond films have a very... and I'm not saying this of every single one of them, because I think Thunderball actually had I mean, she was kind of 50-50. We'll get to that here in a minute. But basically, yes, this film had a female lead that was actually really decent, okay? Again, wasn't just a fawning over James Bond, oh, you're so amazing. Like, she rebuffs him. She tries to, like, because this is one of the reasons why I say alludes to, is because when he's, like, you know, drinking his vodka martini, he's like, should be a memorable flight. And then she's like, you can turn off the charm, I'm immune. And then she turns around and walks off, and Bond's like, huh. Okay. So, and that's kind of the thing, is that in the book, like, Bond slowly turns Pussy Galore away from, I said her name, turns her away from the actual, like, villain, okay? Not the way that he does in the movie, but in the book, it's done a little differently. He kind of, like, slowly kind of turns her away from Goldfinger. And then at the very end, when they're kind of recuperating from the ordeals that Goldfinger put them through, they start to, that's when she starts to kind of change from being a lesbian into being more straight. But it's a gradual thing. It's not like the movie where she's like, you know, no, oh, James Bond is great. Because, you know, he picks her up in the, you know, and, like, throws her in the barn and into the hay, and then it's like, yeah, they basically roll in the hay. And then she changes her tune and becomes, you know, on his side. So it's definitely a lot different, okay? Definitely a lot different. So that's Goldfinger. Not much else to be said. Like I said, this set the tone for all the rest of the films. It set the formula for all the rest of the films that everyone knows and loves. Okay? Now, we're going to be getting into my personal favorite James Bond film. This is my absolute 100% no holds barred certified winner, Thunderball. Okay? Thunderball is my absolute favorite film. Mostly because they actually, for 1965, they filmed 70% of this movie underwater. Which was amazing back then. Okay, and I was coming off of watching movies like The Abyss. Okay, which if you've been on my channel for any length of time, you'll know that I've mentioned a few times that I actually got to meet Michael Biehn, who starred in The Abyss, on the streets of Auckland, New Zealand, and he's an amazing actor. He's an amazing man. He was actually like really. He hated that film. When I asked him, I said, "What movie would you like go back in time if you could go back in time and tell yourself don't do this film?" He goes, "The Abyss," and I'm like, "Really?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "Imagine spending 8 hours a day underwater," and that's kind of what they had on this film. They were underwater for a lot of it, and I got to hand it to them. And they actually had like kind of like they had the big climax at Fort Knox. They had a huge climax underwater. So they had to figure out, like, how are we going to make these guys do things? I mean, there's only so many people that you can shoot with harpoon guns, and so many people you can stab with a knife before it becomes boring. How are we going to do this? And so they had things like people kind of like, kind of like getting their little things, getting their breathing tubes cut, and getting kicked, and different things like that. So it was very inventive, some of the things that they did with this. And it also brought back Spectre, because Goldfinger was not aligned with anybody. He was just doing this on his own. Okay, Spectre's back, baby, and the villain Emilio Largo was number 2, so he was the second in line in the organization. So if like Ernst Stavro Blofeld, who we'll get to here on the next video, if he had died, then Emilio Largo would have been number 1. Okay? And so we actually kind of get to see the Spectre headquarters. So we actually, because like there's a point at which Emilio Largo goes to Paris, and he goes into an office, and he goes into the back, and he pulls out this little thing, and he presses a button, and then he presses another button, and these 2 little doors open, and then he walks in, and there's like this big, long room with all these little chairs, and there's a guy sitting behind some blinds. Hint, it's the same guy that played Professor Dent in this film. Kind of funny. The guy who plays the number 1 character in both Thunderball, and I actually think it was From Russia with Love too. It was played by the guy who played Professor Dent in Doctor No. It's funny because they'll put Blofeld and then they'll put like a little question mark, which I thought was actually kind of cool. But anyway, so Thunderball, one of my personal favorite. It is actually my by and large, far and away, my personal favorite Bond film of the whole series. I absolutely love this film. I think it was an amazing Bond film. I love the plot. It's a typical nuclear weapons theft plot. And Bond goes to the Bahamas, Nassau, to try to find out what's going on, because when he was at a clinic in the beginning of the film, he finds out that there's a guy who was there, and when he opens up the dossier for codename Thunderball, he sees a picture of the man who was dead, and he says and then he sees a picture of the man with a girl. And when he looks it over, it says Francois Derval and Dominique Derval, brother, sister, something like that on the photograph. And so he realizes that it would probably behoove him to go to Nassau and try to enlist her help to figure out what was going on with her brother. Okay, because there's something going on there that's going to affect how everything works, because this guy was sort of like a guy who can, like, basically they put a plastic surgeon together to make this other guy named Angelo, okay, into this guy Derval. Okay, and then they take uh, a female and kind of put her a plant, put her with Derval as sort of a social secretary position, and and to kind of butter him up and get his guard down so that they can kill him and take over. Um, and so and so you have this whole big like plot that goes along, and then this was also the first film where Bond was re-equipped in the field, where Q actually came out to where Bond was and gave him a bunch of equipment. Okay. Things like a rebreather, some different stuff like that. And again, this kind of became where they started using MacGuffins that would end up saving Bond's life. These gadgets from Q Branch that would end up saving Bond's life at some form, some way, shape, or form. Okay. Which, you know, whatever. I mean, to me, it's Bond. It is what it is. Um, and so this kind of became Bond's, like, to me, this kind of became sort of Sean Connery really hitting his stride. He was really comfortable. In Goldfinger, he had gotten to the point where he was now kind of feeling comfortable in the role of Bond. But I think in this movie, he really kind of becomes Bond. Okay? Like, he does things that you would think Bond would do. And just, it's like he really owned the role. And that's what I really think. That's one of the reasons why I love this movie so much. Was the underwater photography was amazing. And, like, Sean Connery just chews up every scene he's in. I mean, it is amazing. It is just phenomenal. Okay? And so it really lends itself to the thing. And if you've ever seen Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery, the original one, there was the ending that they had was he somersaults into his car like he normally would, but because he was thawed out and his equilibrium is still off, he ends up landing on the gear shift, with his ball sack, and then the gal gets in and she grabs the shifter and then rams him in the balls with it. Well, if you watch the deleted scenes of Austin Powers International Man of Mystery, one of the endings was ripped straight from Thunderball. And when I was buying the VHS tapes back in the day, to have the full Bond library at the time, and I was missing Thunderball, and I was back visiting a friend of mine back east, and I had found it, and so I bought it, and we watched it, and he goes, "That's Austin Powers," and I went, "What?" Because I'd never seen it, and that was back when DVDs were brand spanking new, and he said, "Well, watch this," and so he pops the DVD in, and he pops it closed. We watched the film, we laughed all the way through it, and then at the end of it, he went to the special features and he went to the deleted scenes, and he goes, "Watch," click, and as Dr. Evil's base is blowing up at the end of the film, they're in the middle of the desert, and then all of a sudden, they're on a raft in the middle of the ocean. And Vanessa, Elizabeth Hurley's character, goes, "How did we end up here?" And Mike Myers as Austin Powers is like, "This is how all my movies end, baby." And it's like, we were just laughing because we had just watched Thunderball, and he was laughing because that's exactly how this movie ends. Is Bond is on a little raft, and I think they did that because, like, this movie ends that way, and the next movie, You Only Live Twice, ends that way, on a little raft. And, like, in this one, Bond gets picked up by a skyhook, in the other one, a la Batman in The Dark Knight, and in the other one, a submarine comes up and picks up the raft, that Bond and Kissy Suzuki are on. So I think that was one of the things that they were trying to make fun of. Oh, all my movies end this way, baby. So yeah, it was hilarious. So if you're interested, if you like the Austin Powers series, watch this film, because there's some tropes in there that you will see in Austin Powers International Man of Mystery. So anyway, thank you for watching. I appreciate everything that you guys do. I'm sorry this took so long to get out. Like I said, I've been busy and I've been doing other things, and I was kind of doing some apologetic stuff. I took some time off from that. Once I get done with this Bond retrospective, I am going to go back and do that. I think next on the docket, I'm probably going to redo my Mission Impossible retrospective. The last time I did it was when Fallout came out, and now Final Reckoning is coming out this May as of filming this. This is April, so about a month and a half before the movie is due. So I figured I might do that and then go do an actual review of the movie, because I'm going to see it in the theater. Because I haven't been to a movie in the theater since Dune Part 2, so I'm actually kind of looking forward to it. And there's also a new Tron in the works. It's called Tron Ares, and it stars Jared Leto, and it's in the real world. Ponder that for a minute. Then go watch the trailer for Tron Ares. It looks epic. All right? So, smash that like button, hit subscribe, drop a comment below, let me know what you think of this James Bond retrospective so far. And as we say, we will see you on the next one.